Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Bobbi Wegner. I'm a clinical psychologist at Boston Behavioral Medicine, and I'm a lecturer in human development and psychology at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I teach child advocacy there. So why are we here? What brings us here today? Why am I here? What are you here? What are we learning together? We're here to think about how social emotional learning can be incorporated to the virtual classroom. So now more than ever during COVID-19, it is so important to think about incorporating social emotional learning into your virtual classroom. One of the quotes that I really, really love that I thought we could start with is the best teachers show you where to look, but they don't tell you what to see. So what is social emotional learning? What is SEL? If you're not already incorporating it, I'm sure you hear this term being thrown around all the time. People are talking about it, but it can be sort of emotional and a little ambiguous and maybe amorphous. So what is this? But social emotional learning is helping students develop mindsets and skill sets to do three things. One, increase self-awareness. Two, manage emotion. And three, work towards both short-term and long-term set goals. So how we teach as educators impacts our students. I know you know this, and I can almost guarantee this is what drew you to the field. So just pause for a moment and think about your own educational experience. Think about that teacher whose voice still sticks with you. Think about that teacher who's really impacted you on some level. It could be from really early education all the way through your doctoral studies. You can keep your eyes open or closed, but just pause for a moment and think, who was that person? What did they look like? What was their voice? You might even remember the sound of their footsteps. But most importantly, think about how they made you feel. If you were struggling, or you were frustrated, or you were anxious or sad, what did they say to you? What was that feeling on the inside that you felt when you were with this teacher? And just know you can impact a student today just like this teacher impacted you. And what we also know is that students' emotional lives greatly impact how they learn. So what they feel and how they feel when they show up in your real classroom or your virtual classroom really impact their ability to be present and to learn with you. When kids are feeling good and they're feeling content and cared for, they're so much more able to pay attention, to manage their impulses, to remember things, to focus. And I'm sure you know the other side of this too. When kids are anxious, when they're stressed, when they're worried or sad, they're not able to learn in the same way. And if we think about it, this makes really good sense on a very basic physiological level. When kids are stressed and when they're anxious, there's a part of their brain called the amygdala where the fight or flight response comes from. And when that's firing, the frontal lobes suppress. So when the amygdala is stressed and anxious and that fight or flight feeling is there, the frontal lobes suppress. And the frontal lobes are responsible for attention and motivation and memory and impulse control. So of course, stressed and anxious kids can't learn very effectively. And if we just look at what's happening in our culture right now, COVID-19 is creating widespread stress, anxiety, sadness, and grief. I can feel it just stepping outside, watching the news. I'm hearing it from my clients in my clinical work. I'm hearing it from my students. COVID-19 affects everybody. And everyone on some level is feeling some kind of stress, anxiety, sadness, or grief. So regardless of their age or their grade, students need these emotions acknowledged, and they need really basic coping skills to deal with them just to facilitate learning. at the very least. So you might be asking yourself, like, why me? I'm not their mom or their dad or caregiver or even the school therapist. I'm the educator. Like, why is this kind of like my thing? My job's to like teach them. The thing is, we're in this cultural trauma and we're living this emotion right now. And as you know, emotion impacts learning. So if we're not addressing the emotion in the room, then they're just gates and obstacles and barriers to effective learning. And I know you want the best learning environment for your students, so you have to acknowledge the emotional component to get there. Secondly, you might be the only one acknowledging this experience in your student's life. You know, just right now, parents are busy. They're trying to balance a lot between working, caregiving, you know, for their own kids, for their parents, for family members, for the community. Many parents also just don't have the skill set. Nobody taught them, so they're not teaching their children. So at the end of the day, you really might be the only one teaching your students about social emotional learning. And if you really want to think about this on a much bigger level, you're in a pretty unique position to impact a lot of people for a very long time. So what we know just from trauma research is that when the emotional experience of things that are distressing can be expressed and understood on some level, there's much better mental health outcomes for these people. And it doesn't really take a lot. It's naming an emotion, processing it in some way, and moving on. And so you're in this unique position with your classroom right now to really help mental health outcomes just by incorporating a few basic things. So I'll tell you a little bit about my experience as an educator. So I think it was somewhere around March 11th or 12th. I get an email from Harvard saying, I think effective immediately, you know, teaching has to go online. So kind of naively and quite honestly, I just thought, okay, like I can do this for a little bit. I don't think this will be forever. I can translate the lecture piece of the class to an online classroom pretty simply. The discussion-based portion might be a little more tricky, but I'll work around it. So I sort of, you know, confidently logged on the first day, and almost immediately I could just see the feeling on the screen. My students were looking back at me from different places, from their living rooms, from friends' homes, from different states and countries, and the emotion was palpable. I had sort of planned to dive right back into the syllabus, and I thought keeping the structure and the organization would be helpful, but it would have been impossible to just avoid the emotion. So I just said to them, you know, how are you feeling? Where are you? What's going on? And how do you think this is going to impact your learning here in this classroom? And students started sharing. They started talking about stress and anxiety and sadness. And the thing is, we all had this shared experience, myself included. There was stress about getting COVID. There was stress about family members' health. There was stress about the impact of isolation. There was sadness around lost milestones, losing the experience for in-classroom learning they've just paid a lot of money for, losing a graduation, losing structure, losing stability. There was so much sadness and loss coupled with this fear and uncertainty and anxiety that would have just created gates around learning had it not been acknowledged. But instead, we talked about the emotion. It was incredibly connecting. And then we're able to move on and connect it to the content. So as I said, I teach child advocacy, and students were sharing their own experience. And then we really brought it to the population we're learning about. How does this inform our work as child advocates? What can we learn about this experience and how we feel and the people that we're working and advocating for? And because we incorporated the emotional piece of it, the learning is so much deeper, it's so much richer, and it's so much more real. So as educators, it's really important to be tuned into the emotional tone of the room. And there's also a way to incorporate it into the content too. We also know from research that learning and performance improve when stress and anxiety are managed. Learning and performance improve when stress and anxiety are managed. So if your goal, which I know it is to create the best learning environment possible, then one of your goals or sub-goals should be helping students manage stress and anxiety. We also know that when we teach social emotional skills, our students take these skills and this learning and apply it to other parts of their life. So think about the students you work with and think about all the stressors that they're trying to tackle outside of the classroom. And just know some simple skills that you can teach in the classroom can help them manage those other parts of their lives. And I know your job is not to be a therapist. I know that. And I just really suggest you keep it simple, you keep it short, but you incorporate it. Your job is really to acknowledge the feelings, give some basic coping, and then point them in the right direction if they need more support. Right? You just need to, acknowledge the feelings, know that they're there, give some basic coping skills in the morning, in the moment to facilitate learning, but make it crystal clear that you have a toolbox of resources and you're happy to point your students and their families for more support outside of the classroom. So I know you're probably listening to this. My hope is that you're feeling more excited or energized, or you, at least at the very basic level, understand the importance of talking and understanding the emotional piece. But if you're really thinking about like what you can do today and tomorrow and the next week, here's a few basic tips. First and foremost, teach and normalize the relationship between emotion and learning. Oftentimes students will feel, inattentive or unmotivated or anxious, and they assume that's a problem with themselves. They're not understanding that their emotions are really impacting how they're learning. They're distracted not because they're not smart, they're distracted because they're anxious. So every day, take the emotional temperature of the classroom. Ask the students very simply how they're doing. You can do that with a Likert scale, 0 to 10. If 10 was your best day and 0 is your worst, where are you today and why? You can do it with a feelings chart. You email a feelings chart and have students just circle how they're feeling that day, and then talk about why. So you really want them to name the feeling that they're feeling. And you want them to have some kind of opportunity to process it. And of course, this will look different depending on the grade that you're teaching. But for a kindergartner, drawing is really effective. For graduate students, you can tie it to their education and what they're learning. You can talk about how their feelings are informing, the population they're trying to connect with and learn about. For many people, just naming the emotion might be an intervention enough, but for some, they might just need a little bit more. So you can just work with some simple mind-body interventions. Breathe in for 6 seconds, breathe out for 6 seconds. Do that 3 times every day. And lastly, you want to provide resources for outside support. You want to make it so clear that you prioritize social emotional health and that you have resources to give them and to encourage them to seek if they want to and need to. And lastly, kudos to you. I just so appreciate you being here and caring enough. It's so evident that you want your students to be happy and to be healthy and to be available to learn in the best way possible. So as just frontline educators, I just really applaud you and thank you and hope we can keep learning together. Be well, be great, and hope to see you soon.